being
Yeah.
very talented,
He was
perhaps.
probably a pop hero as far as his murals were concerned.
Well, yeah,
An artist.
I mean, his murals are,
Has some
you know,
groupies.
I don't think she would.
absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah,
Um,
that doesn't, that's
And he was
not,
very talented from a very young age, people knew that, and,
that's not a
but personality covers, you know, if you have like, or like,
Yes.
the right, I never know what it
Yeah,
is, we all know,
confidence, yeah.
you know, what women are attracted to, what men are attracted to, it's something about Diego Rivera, remember something about Mary, it's something about Diego Rivera that, you know, clearly made women just sort of turn their heads, and, you know, I think that's certainly gonna be something we talk about today, Diego Rivera's own sort of search for meaning and, you know, getting past all that superficial stuff, and, you know, it could be a big, I knew this friend Dave in New York, and I swear, this guy, so good looking, everyone was just like swooned over him, but it became a big distraction for him, and I'm sure it still is, I like to think it is.
no, that's his thing, right?
What's that?
I mean, yeah, he considered it a distraction.
I mean, everyone has something that, you know, your greatest thing is your
Yeah.
worst thing, your worst thing is your
Well,
greatest thing.
I've considered it too. It's been a distraction in my life.
Yeah. Oh, what a distraction. Okay, so shall we go ahead and start? All right, so, you know, it's a good chance to kind of refresh or at least talk briefly. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the Mexican Revolution, just kind of go over some real quick broad strokes. So, anyone ever seen this guy or heard of him before? This is Porfirio Diaz. I don't know why it has the L there. Sometimes the internet or just people use an L instead of an R. But what would you say about Porfirio Diaz?
You've got some medals.
He's got a lot of medals, right? And I think he probably gave himself his own medals. I think he's like, So, yeah.
Well, and it looks like he died at like 30 something now?
well, that's actually that's a good point. That's actually the length of his reign.
Oh, his reign,
He
okay, I was gonna
prematurely
say,
aged.
he's
So-
clearly
So
over
he is
the
actually
35.
I think he might have been, now I might be off here, but I know he's either half indigenous or full-blooded indigenous. You wouldn't know that because he completely like painted himself to look more European. So he really kind of masqueraded a lot to really kind of try to identify with the upper echelon rather than with the lower echelon. And that brings us back to the reasons for the Mexican Revolution, which was really kind of the caste system, having a lot of people who are untouchable, kind of really down below. You know, Mexico is very diverse, a lot of different languages, a lot of different indigenous people. You see that in Guatemala and Peru. Whereas places like Argentina might not be as kind of indigenous in character. There's obviously exceptions, just like in the United States. But definitely the Mexican Revolution is a reckoning with kind of the overlooked elements of society and the fact that this guy was in power for so long. I mean, people like got sort of sick of the last president, the previous president for that after 4 years. You can imagine like 30 years of one guy in power. And so Mexico was kind of like, you know, ready to awaken after he fell out of power. And it's kind of a complicated story, not super complicated. Basically, there's a power vacuum. He made the mistake of telling an American journalist that he wanted to hold elections, and he didn't really mean it. But then everyone was like, oh, we're going to have elections finally. So he kind of had to allow other candidates, and there was a big power vacuum, and the United States was involved, European powers were involved, and he was seen as someone who was more catering to foreigners rather than to, you know, the average Mexican, and or helping the landed elite. You know, keep in mind in Latin America, you have a big discrepancy between and like here too, but not as extreme, between urban centers and rural parts. Rural parts of Latin America are owned by huge landowners often who have a lot of money and power, and people in the middle class and the merchants live in the city, and they don't want to share power necessarily. So it's really hard to overcome the difference between the rural power and city urban power. And I think we have that in the United States to a degree, you know, liberal urban centers, more rural kind of conservative areas, but it's more pronounced in Latin America. And Mexico is no exception. So it's kind of like having a president means kind of dealing with all these different kind of power or sources of points of power, and the Mexican Revolution is all about kind of settling a lot of the tension between those different groups. So he basically it's kind of, the Mexican Revolution is kind of an interregnum, like after the fall of a, you know, patriarch or leader, you have a power vacuum, and, you know, many movies are about that, you know, whether it's Game of Thrones or Godfather. So I don't want to get too far into it, but basically the average Mexican rose up in protest against the government, thinking they were catering more towards foreign powers like the United States and Britain and others. And at one point, France installed his own king in, not France, but the cousin or I think nephew of Napoleon, not the first Napoleon, but Napoleon who came many decades later. While the United States is embroiled in our Civil War, France installed a relative of Napoleon, puts Maximilian in charge as the Emperor of Mexico for a very brief moment, and the Mexicans end up assassinating him. Even though he was really, like, sincerely, like, I believe in Mexico, he was not seen as a Mexican. So he was really kind of an outsider. It's very fascinating to think of a French king or a French emperor installed on the throne of in Mexico while we're in the midst of a civil war. Now keep in mind, we had the 1848 Mexican-American War. We go to war with Mexico, and many of the soldiers who fought together against Mexico would go on to fight against each other in the Civil War. So, Robert E. Lee and whoever else, they were all kind of together in the Mexican-American War, only to be bitter enemies a few decades later. So the United States is kind of distracted in the 1860s, and these are some views of Mexico, and these are Mexican refugees escaping to the United States during the Mexican Revolution. So, this is right, Mexican aristocrats are begging for work. So this is right on our doorstep, and we have the Panama Canal at this point in 1908, so we've become very protective of that canal, and we don't want anything destabilizing the canal. So that's our point of view. And in terms of Mexico, after the revolution, which takes about 10 years to kind of sort out, very bloody time period, a lot of horrible things happen as you would expect in war. And these artists, after the Mexican Revolution, we'll see Orozco next week, their whole task, their mandate is to visualize Mexican history for the average Mexican. And the big cry to arms is, land and liberty. Most people felt like they were denied land and liberty. And one of the main sources of inspiration for these muralists is a guy named Posada. And we'll talk about him in a moment. And after a decade of making murals in Mexico to crystallize Mexican identity, they go on to come to the United States to make murals because the likes of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and John D. Rockefeller invite these artists to the United States to make murals as part of our good neighbor policy with Mexico, because we don't want them selling oil to Hitler. So this is kind of a big bird's eye view of Mexico from the point of view of Mexico and the United States, and we'll be looking at Diego Rivera here today, seeing his work that he used to visualize first Mexican history, and as a way to crystallize that Mexican identity, because of course Mexico is very diverse and it's hard to have a clear sense of Mexicanness, Mexicanidad, without someone helping to kind of offer some kind of visualization, which is more useful than writing it down, because most people can't read at that time. So we'll be looking at how really the big influence on Christian art in making him understand the need to make art that accessible to the masses, because he could very easily embrace Cubism or modernism because he's in Europe during the Mexican Revolution. And I think that's because his parents knew, keep him safe, we need him after the war, not during the war, we don't want to lose him. So he was kind of sheltered during the Mexican Revolution. These are the big three Mexican muralists, Diego Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros. We'll be looking, I think we don't have class next week. We have July 4th.
Correct.
We're off?
Yes.
Off, okay, so Orozco in 2 weeks, and he's my favorite. And then Siqueiros, who's the youngest of the three. And all three of them come to the United States to make murals because they kind of put the United States to shame with Mexico not only having this awesome romantic revolution, but then these artists who are kind of telling the tale of this revolution. And in the United States, we still don't really kind of know what our artistic sort of mandate is. And, revolutions are very cool to a country that's kind of almost defined by, revolution and enlightenment and a new order. So it's very interesting. I think it was very kind of like growing up during the Cuban Revolution, or being young during the Cuban Revolution. I think likewise the United States was they saw the Mexican Revolution as somewhat romantic. And certainly the artists like Diego Rivera, wanted to romanticize the revolution. And I think in his case especially, to really resuscitate, revive that forgotten Aztec history, which is really central to his artwork, using his paintbrush to visualize that forgotten Aztec and Maya part of Mexican history. So here he is, painted by Frida Kahlo. We saw that last week, kind of romanticizing him. So let's take a look at some of his work. So as you can see, he's got some of that diversity, very characteristic of and typical of Mexicans. A lot of indigenous roots. You meet some people here with indigenous roots, but not as frequently, I think, as in other places in the world. And of course, the United States, we're kind of defined as kind of cutting our roots from the past and starting kind of new, but it's up to each person to decide like how much do you want to emphasize your Italianness or your Irishness or your Greekness, and it's really individual, up to the individual. And of course, in the wake of the Mexican Revolution, you're going to feel this real mandate to want to celebrate, at least in the case of Diego Rivera, his indigenous roots. But he will be in Europe because early on, they recognized his talent, and he did spend some time studying art in Mexico City before going to Europe in 1906, and that's when he was exposed to the work of this guy named Posada. And I think that's really important to understand Diego Rivera, because this guy Posada did a lot of engravings. And these engravings were in the newspaper. And so before we get to mural making, murals that speak to the masses, we have printmaking that speaks to the masses, because everyone can read the cartoons, right? A lot of people can't necessarily read the articles, but everyone can skip to the funny pages and read or see these kinds of engravings. And engravings are a great way to make money, because you can engrave and print it over and over and over. And Posada would try to sell his works for cheap prices so the average person could afford them. So he had a big impact on artists like Diego Rivera, on all three of the big artists we'll see, and others, because he basically was every day. Everyone in Mexico would read these stories or read the newspaper and see these comic strips. And what do you think about, why did he pick a skeleton? Are there any skeleton comics in the United States that you can think of? There's probably one or two, Casper the Friendly Ghost maybe, or something like that. But is the skeleton a big part of, childhood, or why not?
Well, was it part of the Day of the Dead?
I think there's a
celebration
Catholic
that they
observant.
had?
I think there's a big Catholic component to that, where you think of Catholics. I think of like tombs, or like having graves that are often elevated, not buried in the ground. Often tombs, like different grave traditions, and at Day of the Dead, and of course Aztec culture has human sacrifice, and the skeleton is a big part of Aztec mythology. But what else besides culture? Why else? What's the value of a skeleton as a kind of cartoons for the masses? Why a skeleton?
It removes race.
What's that?
There's no racial association.
Very good. And this is actually very similar to some kid in my class recently was like heavy metal. You see a lot of skeletons in heavy metal, and I always thought, like, oh, cool, death is cool, that's why they do that. But it's like, no, it's actually like a universal symbol, because like you said, there's no class or race. You're scraping down to the very core common denominator that connects everyone, which is really cool, because at first glance you might think, oh, this is very macabre or very kind of deathly. But in fact, it's a great way to speak to everyone by getting past that outward kind of superficial differences. So it's kind of like a way of erasing the caste system by saying everybody has a skeleton underneath, and it's definitely an amusing, funny thing to see a skeleton that's kind of animated, because of course our muscles or tendons are what give us expression, not our bones. So I think there's something amusing about this. But so Posada had a big influence on this generation of artists, and he was also very much in support of the Mexican Revolution. So people would daily open up the newspaper, skip ahead to these engravings by Posada. And I think this really sets that template for like art that's accessible to the masses. And then we get back to Diego Rivera deciding what artwork would be fitting for the Mexican Revolution. You really have to keep this in mind, because he understands that this is really a powerful way of speaking to the average person without all the pretense, and in a clear way, a very illustrative way, I think, as you said it. Because of course, when Diego Rivera is in Europe, the big thing is not engravings, it's going to be like Cubism and Picasso and others. So these are a lot of fun. Riding a bicycle, bicycle is universal. Skeleton universal is really fun to see, but so distinctly Mexican, because I think of Catholicism and Aztec culture, and I think it has to do with the diversity and the tension. Now you see this in Europe. This is after the Black Death. Here we've got skeletons rising up and taking over. Those, I guess, are the royalty down below. They were aristocracy. This is 1300s and the 1330s, 1340s, when the Black Death completely destroyed the world. And this is people, later reflecting on it, or because the Black Death continued. It really continued, I think, until the 1700s. Not as people developed an immunity to it, but it was still part of life. And just the idea of a skeleton kind of rising up and dominating everything, I think, really is the closest example of that we might see in maybe I don't want to say obviously the United States, but England, Europe, that we don't really have in the United States. I mean, I'm sure there's some exceptions. In fact, after COVID, I did notice in Halloween there's a lot more skeletons. I don't know if you guys noticed that. In the last few years, skeletons have become much more common in Halloween. Big skeletons in people's front yard and things like that. So who knows? Maybe it's related to COVID. Maybe it's because of Mexican culture. I don't know.
I think it's just merchandise.
Just merchandise, China. It's China. We know what the next. No, it's true. In New York, every summer in New York, I was in New York for 18 years. Every summer was a clear, like someone decided in a dark room somewhere that yellow sunglasses will be the thing this summer. And then or gold bling, and then everyone in New York does that, and then next year it's some new fashion. So you're right. There's a kind of a capitalistic element to it. Anyway, dancing skeletons.
We were talking about Stoicism before.
Yeah.
And one of the expressions is memento mori.
Memento mori, right?
And it's always, death is always close. And I would think death would have been much more closeness in this time period, maybe in Mexico. So it's just a constant reminder that death is.
And I think that's what keeps maybe people like being grounded in a certain kind of way. I think in Mexico you have much more of a sense of community, including funeral processions and birth processions and marriage stuff. So yeah, I do think that really, and of course Catholicism is kind of monolithic religion in Mexico versus very different groups of Protestantism. So yeah, I think it's a lot more of just a kind of a grounded culture.
Part of life.
And connects more directly back to Europe and Spain than I think the United States, which is kind of a melting pot or a salad bowl, depending on which metaphor you want to use. Yeah, and it's very interesting. That's what makes us great too, because people assimilate into this common language, kind of like the Roman Empire, I think. And with all the benefits of that, but of course everything's a trade-off. So if you want to kind of have a culture where everyone assimilates, that means you kind of have to each decide how much you want to celebrate your own roots, tracing them back to, a lot of recent immigrants struggle with, which language you speak at home, how do you dress. When I was in Guatemala, in the Peace Corps, in the mountains, and working with coffee growers, the guy who was the accountant would change clothing out of his indigenous clothing and speak Spanish instead of his indigenous language and have a whole different, identity for work than he did when he was in his home. So, yeah, I think that's part of, modern life too, to a degree. And what we're going to see today, of course, with Diego Rivera is him navigating through a lot of this because he's growing up in a time where a lot of exciting things are going on in technology. You got eugenics, that's not very exciting, but eugenics is, trying to sterilize people to create, get rid of morons, as the word was coined, and to use genetics to create a better race of people, which in theory might be good until you realize it's very hard to do because they thought with fruit flies you can identify, okay, fruit flies, but it's like clusters of genes is how it works, not like one gene for anger, one gene for Aryan, one gene for like good or bad. So it's very complicated. And we have, in this time period, in the 1920s, vaccines are on the rise, industrialization. So while we watch Diego Rivera's artwork transform, we're really kind of talking about our own experience of the 20th century with technology and world changing. And the question, of course, is also what role does religion play in Diego Rivera's life? And I think you really have to understand that he's definitely a communist. And what do communists think about religion?
Opium of the masses.
Yeah, that's Karl Marx, I think he said that. Religion is the opiate of masses. I mean, in a way, like, communism is the opiate of masses, too. It's like, they're all this kind of like, I think you could really say that, communism at this point, if we're looking back at communism now from, the 21st century, I think from Diego Rivera's point of view was maybe a little more, uncertain about what it could bring, and now I think we look back and say, well, it's capitalism, communism, you need kind of a blend of both, and it's about human nature and technology. But I think what's interesting with Diego Rivera is he will find that kind of, is technology capitalism or is it communism? Do communists hate technology? Not really. So it's a kind of a common ground. You could go either way with, industrializing a factory. The big difference is who owns it, right? That's who the owner, or the worker's the owner, or is the, scheming capitalist overlord the owner. And so we'll see that also, especially when it comes to the United States and sees all the technology in the United States. So here he is in Spain. It looks like Spain to me. I don't know, maybe it's not Spain, but I think Avila is Spain. And he's a great, look at these great paintings. They're really, these are like, incredible paintings, and he's a very young man. This is right before the Mexican Revolution breaks out, and so he's painting in Europe, and kind of mastering, his own style and technique. And he comments, we were talking earlier about he's not a very attractive guy. Maybe when he was a little younger, maybe a little more.
He's trying.
He's trying. Yeah, when I look at this, I see a blend of Frodo, Aragorn, and Gandalf. All in one. One figure, without the beard or something. But yeah, there's something attractive about it. He clearly got such kind of a presence, and maybe a kind of very kind of a magnetic like gaze or something. But yeah, a young man in Europe going around looking all like kind of handsome and debonair, in total splendid isolation from the Mexican Revolution. And he will visit, but only briefly. And this is what's going on in Mexico. This is Pancho Villa and his other Mexican revolutionaries, looking all kind of awesome. I gotta admit, the blend of kind of being a cowboy. What's that?
I said, which one was Pancho Villa?
Pancho Villa is this guy right here. This guy right here. I can't help but think of the Three Amigos when I see this. I don't know. What day? Which is not a very good movie. When you're 12, it's really funny, but not when you're 40. But yeah, it's very romantic, I think. Kind of like, almost like a precursor for Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Kind of cowboy, guerrilla leader. And here they are when they arrive into the capital of Mexico City. Pancho Villa on the left and Emiliano Zapata on the right. Both of them are offered the crown or leadership, and they both say, we're not crazy, we're not going to do that, we'll get assassinated. And so they last a few more years, and they do both get assassinated eventually. So Mexico, you're kind of nuts if you want to be president in Mexico, which is why they only have one term in Mexico, by the way. So I just want to point out, so here it says, Rivera was convinced that if ordinary people are to be expected to look at art with enjoyment, the artist must provide them with forms which not only employ the techniques of modern art and reflects its qualities, but also of sufficiently simple design and engaging content to be interesting and comprehensible at first glance. So I think that's really important to understand, that he makes a deliberate effort to make his art not kind of too ivory tower, not too kind of inaccessible to the public at large. What do I mean by that? Well, this is even like, this is abstraction, but not abstraction. This is still kind of somewhat recognizable, but and this is Picasso deliberating or kind of debating over what role does Cubism play, and basically in Europe there's a shift away from naturalism, from observing life as a basis for art, because photography is now able to take pictures better than an artist can, and artists want to explore the possibilities of abstract art, and that's all great and all well and good, I love it, but it definitely means that, it means if all art becomes abstract, then you're losing touch with perhaps that clarity of an engraver like Posada, who is able to speak clearly to people, and that's not to say that there's nothing wrong with speaking clearly to the higher elite intellectual circles, but you do make a trade-off when you do that. And Diego Rivera has to decide which chorus is he preaching to, this one or this one down here, and he has to kind of decide. And to his credit, I think he basically says, look, this stuff's great, using Freud is on the rise at this time, Jung, and questions about the subconscious, and using artwork to channel the subconscious and focus on things like suppressing desires, suppressing sexuality, and that's all really interesting stuff, but not necessarily the stuff that will speak to the average Mexican coming out of the Mexican Revolution. Freud waits until after the revolution is over. If you sit on the couch, you don't sit on the couch during the revolution. You sit on it way after. And so, something like this, a recherche, I think it's recherche, right? You see, what do you see? A pelvis, you see a butterfly, and this very cool stuff that really inspires a lot of artistic interest in surrealism, stuff like you might see with Frida Kahlo, but very not useful to someone like Diego Rivera when it comes to this mandate of visualizing Mexican identity. So he's, Diego Rivera is very much interested in the stuff going on in Europe, like Cubism. And in fact, I love Diego Rivera's Cubism a lot more than Picasso, because as much as I like some of Picasso's work, the gray kind of muddy Cubism has always been just so European in the worst way for me. Whereas Rivera is like, let me add some color to Cubism. So that's cool, and I like it. It's really neat to see his own twist on Cubism, obviously adding a little bit of Mexican flavor to it. But clearly an amazingly talented painter. Even his Cubist stuff is pretty cool. But it doesn't work. This is a great example of how it really doesn't work. I mean, I love it, but it doesn't work as far as like, he's trying to use Cubism to talk about the Mexican Revolution with guns and elements of Mexico, but you show this to the average Mexican, they're gonna probably be like, a gun, So you can see the dilemma, and I think it's such a fascinating dilemma too, because as an artist, you want to kind of innovate and trailblaze and be kind of at the cutting edge, but you don't want to lose behind your audience. So at this point, he's dating a woman, or I don't know, dating, but they were lovers, whatever, and she gets pregnant. And he kind of chronicles the kind of unfolding or the development, and even chronicle, I think, and then it leads to the child dying. So he's using Cubism to kind of chronicle his own personal story, and it leads to this real, I think, really horrible death of the child that inspires him to take this journey to Italy with his friend Siqueiros, which is the guy on the right there. Hitler kind of made mustaches, out of fashion, but before that, they were everybody. So, except Diego Rivera. This is Siqueiros, this is Diego Rivera, and this is like selfie station here, or something. They got the backdrop of like, I don't know, Europe or something there in the back. But they go and travel to Italy. This is Siqueiros with the most, like the hardest name to pronounce in English. Siqueiros, Siqueiros you'd often hear, and it is really annoying. The I and the ear can be annoying. But yeah, that's Siqueiros, and here he is here, and Diego Rivera on the right, and Orozco, who we'll be talking about next time. Both to get all three together. This is, all of them assembled probably around 1910 thereafter for, what are we going to do with painting? And they each are competing, but they all have the same mandate in Mexico to paint murals. And much of it was really, the template was set by Diego Rivera. I don't know why my red line doesn't go all the way to Italy, but he takes a trip from Northern Europe to Italy and sees all this amazing Christian art. And this is really important in terms of us talking about Christianity and the Mexican Revolution, because basically the template is the artists in Europe used painting to visualize stories from Christianity, and Diego Rivera likewise will use painting to visualize the history of Mexico. And why did artists in Europe do this? Well, because the average person couldn't read the Bible, and so these artists did a great job in kind of enhancing Christianity by giving the average person a real familiarity with the stories, to the point that you feel like you're there. It really immerses you, and I think adds so much power to the story, because, I mean, in Islam, you don't see Muhammad and Allah, you don't see, they don't tell the stories of the Quran, because they want to leave God in heaven, and you don't want to degrade God by visualizing him. But in Christianity, it's like, well, you're not meant to worship this painting so much as worship the story that this painting depicts. And it becomes a real issue, because it's like, well, where does art begin and religion stop? Where do you start degrading God? When you visualize him in human form, and this is always a dilemma in religion. But for our purposes, you really have to understand Diego Rivera is not Christian, and yet he clearly understands the value of painting as almost like a spiritual act of community or identity. And so there is a Diego Rivera painting, I think, very much taking a page from the deposition of lamentation here. Of course, in this case, you're lamenting the revolutionary who's been whipped basically suffering on behalf of Mexican liberation. And that's, these are meant to be like Pancho Villa and other Mexican revolutionaries. And here's Giotto, visualizing the last judgment, of reckoning with, your own life, your own choices in life, and, you can go down to hell or you can go up to heaven. And a clear central subject holding everything together. And that's going to be something that really dogs Diego Rivera, because on one hand, he's going to want to visualize Mexican history without a hierarchy, because he doesn't want that hierarchy still there, because that is what led to the Mexican Revolution, this very rigid hierarchy. But if you get rid of hierarchy, then the painting loses a lot of focus. So that's a really interesting theme in his work, is how do you have a clear central focus without kind of creating a new hierarchy, metaphorically speaking. So you can see the blend of architecture and painting, and that's really important for understanding the church as a kind of pop-up book for the Bible, if you will. And of course, it's very different than in Catholicism than it is in Protestantism, where you don't as much heavily depend on artwork for visualizing the stories, because a lot of Protestants are literate, different age. But I think you guys understand that these artists were from a time when not everyone could read, and now we're bringing to life these artworks as a way to really kind of crystallize Christian identity and bring, strengthen the power of the church. And of course, this is, a great blend of architecture and painting by Michelangelo. Here's his Last Judgment. You really see how the building and the paintings are integrated together. And all of this will really have a big impact on Diego Rivera because he sees the power of murals, using architecture to paint pictures, and of kind of naturalism, the clarity of storytelling on a wall, because of course the other current in Europe is this, and this is still pretty, I think, recognizable for most people, but of course abstract art will continue to become more abstract, and while I think this is great, this is not necessarily going to help maybe if you leave it kind of a blend of something recognizable and abstract, it works, but I think this seems too kind of abstract for painting on the walls of Mexican institutions. For the average Mexican, it might just seem a little too, self-indulgent or bizarre, but who knows. But they basically make a choice to focus on painting, to use painting to visualize some of these things that you see here with the Mexican Revolution: public education, separation of church and state, right to organize, land reform, nationalization of oil. Of course, you don't see anything necessarily Christian there, but you have to understand this is, revolution, and you have to think about, well, what is Diego Rivera's own relationship to, not just maybe Christianity, but like, what is the spiritual nature of art? And, is there like a blind spot in his artwork where maybe it's a struggle with reconciling communism, capitalism, maybe, or just what, as we look at his artwork, you have to kind of think about, is there a kind of overlooked Catholic side here? Is there a mean-spirited kind of rejection of anything church-related or Catholicism? And I do definitely think he's someone who sees, kind of because he's a communist, he sees religion as the opiate of the masses, but that's such a kind of, that doesn't really solve anything, at least I think from our perspective, because we know that communism hasn't solved the world's ills. So I think it's an interesting thing to think about, whether or not there's a blind spot in his work, even though he's so clearly interested in speaking to the masses. And I think you see here, Mexico became a real source of inspiration for his painting when he gets back from 10 years of being in Europe. And this is the first thing he paints when he gets back. And this is all commissioned by the Mexican government deliberately to visualize Mexican identity. This is in an auditorium, and remember, and notice the title, Creation. That definitely feels like it has a lot of relation to Christianity. Although, do you see anything religious or Christian stand out here in his artwork?
Well, the
wings
central
at the
figure.
top.
Yeah, the wings. Where do you see the wings?
At the top.
Yeah, the wings is almost like toes or wings sticking out above them. Absolutely. Anything else?
Yeah, the central figure looks like it's a crucifixion.
Looks like it.
The other picture you showed, it looks like a crucifixion.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, like a crucified figure, and maybe without, or like welcome, but certainly you could see that as both. And I see halos. So I think it's kind of like you said, you could say like zeitgeist. I think it's more. It's like he can't. It's like he has to be too cool for Christianity, and yet it seems like he's still going back to it. And this is a big struggle in his painting career, not selling out to the capitalists, being true to communists, and that I think will culminate with the last picture we'll see, which is Man at the Crossroads, where he has to really walk that fine line between, wanting to enjoy and celebrate the United States, but not wanting to see like a sellout and this is another guy who was a big inspiration. He's the one who came up with an art style that's uniquely Mexican. He's like the Thoreau or the Emerson of Mexico. I think that's a pretty fitting description. And he's the one who brings together all the different Mexican muralists and says, look, you guys need to paint Mexican identity, paint Mexican Mexicanidad, launch a movement, a style that's uniquely Mexican. And so these three guys really have this mandate, and I'm going to show you some of Diego's paintings in the National Palace, but I don't want to spend too much time to see how they're integrated into the palace. And you have to remember, this is a place where people would come to maybe get, paperwork for their, motor license, or maybe house property stuff, bureaucracy. So you come from the countryside into the city, and you are kind of faced with this kind of this beautiful collection of paintings, and this is your chance to learn about Mexican history. So your average Mexican, you see these paintings that are really, I think, is meant to, and it does what it's meant to do. It's just kind of show you scenes from everyday Mexico. It's supposed to be very inclusive You notice it's divided between fiesta, which is like, you know, celebration, and labor. So those are the two big themes connecting all these murals. Here's celebration. So this is kind of very typical Diego Rivera, crowded with a bunch of people. There's actually Diego Rivera. Where's Waldo effect here? Where's Diego Rivera? There he is. And then this dancing skeletons up above, typical. You know, I think you have a lot more festivals in everyday life in Mexico than you do in the United States. You know, like you would see in New Orleans kind of thing. Like, you know, a lot of those kinds of. It's a big part of. I think it has a lot to do with colonialism too, like relieving tension because of different groups, giving people a chance to party. Like during the pandemic, remember New Yorkers would like howl from their apartments. They needed some kind of escape. So I think these parties, these celebrations are a way to release tension. And this, I think, is an interesting one to focus on because you could see he's really kind of, I think there's a lot of that kind of European, let's put everybody on stage, but it's not the same as this one's telling you clearly your last judgment, you go to hell, you go to heaven, you want to go to heaven, you don't want to go to hell. Whereas this, it's a little, you know, what do you think is his main goal here? What do you think he's trying to do with this painting? What do you see here? Is this modern Mexico?
Like a market.
Yeah, like a market, and it's probably Aztec Mexico from before the Spanish arrived. This was the capital of the Mexican Empire, the Aztec Empire. This is the city that's now Mexico City. It used to be Tenochtitlan. And so what's he doing here? What's he trying to do? You said market.
Showing life.
Yeah, everyday life. So it's a really, you know, just that, you know, let me resuscitate, revive this lost history. And
I think it legitimizes
yeah,
your heritage.
Your heritage,
And
yeah,
also
exactly.
doing farm workers or something, you're saying, gee whiz, this artist, I really do something special, even if I'm a farmer and I do come from special people that
Right, I think that's
documented in art.
yeah, that's spot on, to legitimize that history that up until, I mean, Porfirio Diaz, the leader, was literally painting his face so he didn't look indigenous. And now Diego Rivera's like, no, that's okay, it's okay to be indigenous, it's okay to have, you know, your own part of Mexico. You are a part of Mexico too. So it's really paintings about unity and inclusion and resuscitating that long dead Aztec history. Remember, Diego Rivera is literally like unearthing, you know, statues and figurines, and he creates a museum of Aztec, heritage, because he's literally like Indiana Jones digging up the past. And so he's really got this real personal interest in celebrating Aztec history.
And it's complex. I mean, it's really complex, and you can see a lot of commerce and all kinds of people taking part of it. So it's vibrant and alive and very, you know, it's a very intricate and complete sort of society.
Yeah, and one thing I point out, so when you notice, where is the eye level here? When you look at a painting, where is the eye line? So where do you?
That line going across.
Yeah.
Where there's an upper and a lower.
Yeah, so usually when you see the horizon line, if the eyeball is right at the horizon line, that means you're at eye level with the subject matter. So if the horizon goes up, that means you're suddenly, if the horizon's above the subject, that means you're also above the subject. Your aerial view would be the horizon line's above the subject. When it gets below the subject, like in a lot of Christian paintings, that means you're slightly below the Virgin Mary, slightly below Jesus. So why does he have the horizon line way up there? Why did he choose to do that?
They're all up.
Yeah, so he kind of just so you can get a view of everything, right? But the trade-off there is then you're somewhat above everything, and now you're kind of like in a drone above everything, and that's fine. But then, of course, now you have to kind of like navigate through all the. You've kind of got a stage display where everybody's on stage and not one central character stands out. I think he's trying to overcome that with that little kind of connection between sexy. I don't know who she. I think it's literally an Aztec prostitute, and I don't know who that is. Maybe like who was the leader of the Aztecs again? I'm forgetting now. For some reason, I'm drawing a blank. But I think Montezuma. I want to say Muhammad. Montezuma's Revenge, right? So yeah, he's kind of overcoming the overwhelming kind of ness of the painting by having a little emotional connection between those two, and that becomes like almost a template for that tricky element of how do you give us something to focus on in spite of the kind of everything, kind of the overwhelming visual quality of his work. Now, why is he putting everyone on stage? Because he wants everyone to be included. He doesn't want any hierarchy. But I think he realized you need some kind of focus or else you'll feel overwhelmed by his work. So, like here, for instance, the horizon line is down here, right around here. We're at eye level with these guys, and he's right above us. In fact, you notice we're above him, so we're kind of on a horseback or something here. So it's very interesting when you think about the horizon line and why the artist might choose it to be one place or the other. It's kind of one of those invisible choices that artists make that you kind of have to scrape away to see, and the value of it, in this case, it immerses you in the kind of ground level. And here he's got the horizon line way up there, so you can get this aerial view of everyone, but it kind of removes you from the scene to a degree. And just to show you some more of that. And this is really the nature of the Mexican Revolution. These artists, visualizing these scenes and using the whole, instead of using a church to visualize the Bible, now we're using government institution to visualize Mexican history. And I would argue that that's not, you're still kind of treating public space as like a sacred space. And I think that's what's because if I go to a government building, now there's suddenly a mural there. It's much more than like just a cold, stale government building. Now it's like more like a church in a way than a government building, depending on how you see, a building as a place to create a sense of identity and a place of nationalism. It's to go from a government institution being the sort of chief sort of outlet of the upper classes to being like, for everybody. Now the building's for everybody. It used to be these buildings were for the elite white Mexicans, and now it's for every Mexican. So that's really the nature of the revolution. And as Americans in the United States are hearing about this, we're really put to shame because in Mexico they had this revolution and now this really rich renaissance of artwork. There's no you can't cite a U.S. renaissance of art in the 1800s. There's no because we had the Civil War, we have all kinds of, our own growing pains, our own kind of development. And then Mexico comes and shames us with this really, rich tradition of painting. And that's a big part of why, in addition to the fact that they have a lot of oil and World War II is on the horizon, that's why we end up inviting these artists to the United States to kind of show us the way forward, artistically and otherwise. So these are really neat paintings, but I want to, and by the way, this is showing a woman going out to the countryside to read for a literacy campaign in the countryside, and this guy's here to protect them from the landowners who don't want the peasants becoming literate, because once they become literate, they're going to say, wait, we want rights, just like lectores in Ybor City. They started clamoring for forming labor unions, and then all the cigar factories were firing the lectores, no labor unions. So a lot of the same thing happens in the 20th century in other places. And so, and I mean, these are really big. You've got this is like the worker and the farmer coming together. It's kind of like a crucifixion, but a little more maybe upbeat in this case. But a lot of kind of Christian element keeping it all together that probably Diego Rivera would be the last one to acknowledge, and yet it's pretty obvious that there's the Christian influence on his work is still there, even if not so conspicuous. And here we're actually in a chapel. I don't think this is a church necessarily anymore, but what do you think of his approach to painting inside of a church here? Any comments? I don't think I see many churches, Catholic or otherwise, with a nude.
Pretty risque.
This goes to Diego Rivera. his own womanizing or whatever. So it's very bizarre. The red is definitely overwhelming. Probably a communist. He probably did that for communism. I point that out because up above, I mean, this one's kind of cool. I do like the idea of nourishing, the corn being nourished by the fallen revolutionaries. I'm not really sure if that's like a moon with like the sun. It's always struck me as like very collage-like. I'm not sure what's going on. What is it?
Eclipse.
Eclipse? Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and that would kind of relate to like the celestial cosmic order of things shifting and changing. And the red, I mean, even over there, that's really bizarre. It looks way too kind of weird for a church. But I think he's not like trying to be true to Christianity here so much as create like a church of communism here. And I say that because up above, you can see these two guys fighting over, or I don't know, fighting aggressively.
The symbols, the sickle and the hammer.
The hammer and the sickle, which of course we know is the symbols of communism, right? The hammer is like industry and the sickle is farming, and the two of them together. And Karl Marx, you can understand, I've read the Communist Manifesto in college, I've read Das Kapital, and it's not hard to read, but his German is very very logical, and there's a certain kind of, on the page is an alert, like, oh, you work 5 hours a day, like, yeah, these bad guys, they're the ones to blame, like, oh, Elon Musk, he's a trillionaire, he's taking everything away from me because he has all that money, but it's really like, you kind of have to overlook human nature and kind of believe that Karl Marx had all the answers. Because he didn't understand that, capitalism is a very shifty thing, because once industrialization happened, then you can outsource those jobs to another country, right? So it's not like it's just this one monolithic thing that you can fight against and oh, we've defeated capitalism. No, capitalism's like human nature and materialism. But of course, that's where I think capitalism and communism overlap, and with materialism. Materialism is by definition shifts you away from spirit to spirit and kind of something that keeps you humble and keeps you kind of more grounded. And so I think communism is just sort of substituting one ism for another, and I think Diego Rivera will kind of have to wrestle with whether or not communism is the final answer, especially when we talk about the United States, because he knows in the United States communism is kind of a dirty word, especially as we move into the Cold War. So, we looked at Frida Kahlo last week. They're married at this point, and they go to the United States together. And yeah, we can shift away from the Mexico, visualizing Mexico for the illiterate, like we see here. Organizing the architecture into different spaces to tell the story. That's what I think Diego Rivera is doing there. But without a clear central focus, and I think that really does detract from his work, at least from the point of view of maybe an artistic point of view, or even from the point of view of just like there needs to be some kind of sense of something we can cling to, just like a story in a movie. We need some central character, or else it just feels like kind of you're just throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall. And his work is definitely kind of overwhelming in a lot of ways. In person, I think it's probably a very different experience, but I think again he's trying to include everything and just kind of that's what he's trying to do. Will that work in the United States? Well, we'll see in a moment, but here you can see some of the different, so visualizing, Mexican history, the Maximilian, that's Porfirio Diaz. This is more independence era. Porfirio Diaz ends up in power, and then we got the Mexican Revolution, reform, and, this would be U.S. invasion when we invade during the Mexican Revolution, and then then of course they all come to the United States to paint pictures, so we'll check ahead to that. And yeah, the one thing he always has in the middle is this kind of flirtatious looking like figure with this flirty looking eyeball, which you'll see in some of his other pieces. For some reason, he always has this like central figure that's like flirting with you. You'll see that in the horse. We'll see this guy next week, or next class with Orozco, where we look at Benton, who's kind of the U.S. equivalent of Diego Rivera. And he's kind of the guy to beat. He's like the U.S. equivalent of a really great muralist, and we'll compare him with Orozco's work. But for now, remember that Diego Rivera arrives in New York the United States during the Great Depression. So it's definitely kind of a sad period for the United States, and a lot of Mexicans are being repatriated back to Mexico, while Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo are going the opposite direction. So it's a very interesting time, a lot of tension between Mexico and the United States, because people think Mexicans are taking U.S. jobs, and you've got, between World War I and World War II, you've got eugenics, you've got the progressive movement, you've got, the jungle, people fighting against child labor. So it's a lot of, I think this is like the modern world that we live in now coming together and like maturing, if you will. And so at this point, the United States is really has no interest in modernism the way we will after World War II, when we take a real interest in European immigrants escaping from Hitler, and they have a big influence on our artwork. Before that, we really rejected anything modernism, which is why we're so interested in what's going on in Mexico, because we're like, artists are like, oh, how is Mexico discovering itself without leaning on, what's going on in Europe? So he paints this mural in San Francisco, and, I think, again, he's trying to find some central figure to bring it all together, and that, I think, is this kind of miserable mechanic or something there you see in the back, which will become kind of a motif in his work, the kind of central figure in the back. And this is like a painting of a painting. This is Diego Rivera, painting this painting. And you can already see it's like a celebration of productivity. And I think this is where he starts upsetting the communists in Mexico and abroad, because he's seen as kind of celebrating capitalism. And I think that especially becomes the case when he comes to the United States and paints pictures in Detroit. So he gets this Detroit commission in 1932, $20,000, probably a lot of money back then. I don't know how to adjust that for inflation. And here's the Detroit murals, and this is national patrimony. You can go to Detroit and see this if you want. This is in the age when Detroit was the hub or its epicenter of automobile. And I think now a lot of those jobs, ironically, are probably in Mexico and other countries, so it's very funny, I think. But here you can see the murals that he made in Detroit. And this is all commissioned by Henry Ford. And any comments on either how his work is evolving or anything about just kind of what you think he's trying to do with these paintings? So he would go around the factory and sketch and draw and kind of rub shoulders with the workers. Anything Christian in this painting? Not really, right? He's not like kind of, and I'd say there's nothing. It's not like these are suffering workers. What do you think? What's the message here? What's the tone of this painting?
They're multicultural.
Yeah, and they're probably more diverse than it actually was. I don't think there were different races working side by side in Detroit. I think he's projecting onto like he's taking his Mexico inclusiveness and inclusivity and projecting it onward. And what about technology? Is technology this evil, oppressive thing? No, I think it looks like it's kind of awesome. He's like, oh, everyone's working together. So it's kind of like it looks like he's kind of there's no criticism of capitalism here. He's not kind of saying, oh, these are all exploited people. And I think this is really why his communist buddies would get so upset with him, because it looks like kind of a utopia of machinery. And in a way, kind of it is, from our point, I mean, looking back now, because it's kind of like, it'd be great to get a factory job now and, you have a good, job, but, obviously we don't work in factories in the United States anymore. We've outsourced a lot of that. Now we have AI centers, right? So, and I don't think Jay Rivera would go around AI, data center and be like, wow, I think he would probably be pretty critical of that. But it's so interesting to think about going from visualizing Aztec history to now he's celebrating, U.S. industrialization. But I think this goes a long way in explaining why his next mural, the one that gets censored and destroyed, will be kind of him dealing with criticism from his communist friends who are saying...
Was he commissioned? Was he given a title to do, and he was commissioned to do it?
Yeah, he was commissioned to make these all by the Henry Ford Motor Company.
So it was put in his head.
Yes, and he was very true. I think he showed a sketch to Henry Ford. Henry Ford liked that, and the rest is history. So that was a very clear kind of connection between the original sketch and the final product, which is not true when it comes to the New York mural that he does. But these are really, exceptional murals. You can see it's a whole room dedicated to it. You can see up above, there's kind of, he tells the story of the mining and the processing of ores that go into the machinery. Some of these elements are kind of deliberate effort to show like an Aztec god in the back. The machine is meant to represent like an Aztec statue. Slide
it's much cooler in colors, like blues.
What's that?
It's much cooler in colors.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because I definitely see him making a big leap with his painting in terms of the whole environment is part. It's not like there's up there, and it's all immersive. And you notice there's the colors have this inner light, because you notice this like a furnace is illuminating things. So that I think is really what was really so genius about this painting. Everything's connected by that light, that inner light, that furnace, that's shining light onto the foreground here. It kind of reminds me of the movie Metropolis, which is a Fritz Lang movie, like people working together. But this is much less like critical. Metropolis is like these poor, miserable workers who are like kind of zombie workers, whereas this is like, yes, let's work hard. And it's
it's really cooperative.
Yeah,
it's really cooperative. The people are working together.
Yeah, and not a criticism of capitalism at all. No. And so that's really why I think Diego, it helps explain his next paintings. And I love these. I think this is such a cool...
Did Ford do like a $5, don't we interrupt, but a $5 a day or something?
Yeah, the whole Ford model is really awesome, because Ford was like, look, I want my workers to be able to afford the car. Which is, I think, why we've become such a prosperous country, because you're not thinking short term, you're thinking long term. Kind of like Ybor investing in the trolley and the casitas here, so the workers wouldn't go to work, drenched in rain or liquefied by the melting sun. So these workers, it was really a utopic vision of capitalism, and I think that's true to what he was seeing. He was witnessing machines and workers all kind of benefiting from it. And some of the other elements you see, like these are people coming to go witness the creation of the cars, and there's Ford there, I think on the right, and here's a big machine trying to resemble an Aztec statue, and these are workers. I think in some cases it's pharmaceuticals, like people working, to medicine, and him kind of understanding the industrialization of vaccines. That's what you see there, a kid being vaccinated. Remember I said the flirtatious horse, that's flirtatious animals, always like some flirtatious horse in his pictures there on the left. But yeah, vaccinating children. So you can see he's kind of seeing industrialization as kind of panacea. It's going to solve all the problems.
But unattractive faces.
What's that?
Unattractive faces.
Yeah, there's those there, especially something kind of creepy alien-like about them. Kind of like a what do you call green
Is there not
aliens?
something kind of Christian there though? It's a mother and a baby.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Really,
There's always there's like a whole there's absolutely kind of a like beyond the veneer, or just when you scratch the surface, it's like, oh wait, there's something Christian, and that's why I think it's so interesting when as an art historian, like Christianity cannot be separated from storytelling, from filmmaking, because so much of it is about the hero's journey and a moral story, and it's really, you can't, just the history of Western art is inseparable from Christianity, and likewise, it's just, as an artist, even the most devout communist, you really can't get away from needing some kind of core, kind of moral story, which is, I think, what, again, helps explain the next mural that he makes, because he still needs this kind of central figure. So the Rockefellers, being shamed by the Fords, now want to, pony up some money to have their own mural in New York City. And of course, the Rockefeller, Standard Oil, they want it. And this is the MoMA commissioning Museum of Modern Art in New York, which had one solo show for Matisse, and then the next solo show was for Diego Rivera. So, Matisse, Diego Rivera, that's pretty amazing company to share. And so he makes all these murals in New York City for the MoMA show, and they really show you him illustrating, in this case, Mexican history for the average American, the average New Yorker, and Conquest, the Lamentation, equivalent of Lamentation, Zapata with his white horse, the uprising against, and so this is chronicling Mexican history, it's sharing a little bit about Mexico, but these are wonderful paintings, maybe not as busy as his other paintings. These are portable murals that he makes, but the real famous one, let's get into all this, these are the murals. This is one he makes about New York City, showing kind of it's a strange mural because I think it's the Great Depression, so a lot of people are really suffering. It really resembles contemporary present day New York in a lot of ways, like the High Line. That's the High Line when they have the park on the west side. I guess these are people sleeping, I don't know, maybe underground, but definitely clear sense.
Yeah.
They
did.
Yeah, it's like a hierarchy.
The guy looks like a soldier or
Yeah.
guard or
Yeah.
something.
And again, remember, it's a time of kind of contradiction because Diego Rivera is in the United States when all the Mexicans are being repatriated. So he must have felt kind of a little bit of like a little bit of hypocrisy or something, or just seeing people waiting in soup lines, bread lines. What do you see?
The title is Frozen Assets.
Oh yeah, frozen. Yeah, and Wall Street kind of term, right? Makes me think of like Operation Wall Street. What was that? Operation Wall Street. Is that what it's called? And people occupied downtown Manhattan.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, and I see like crane, maybe development on top. That's and everything down below is kind of overlooked, the marginal. So you can see he's kind of got this like class struggle, conscientiousness, something going on there. But let's jump ahead to the mural that he made, because he makes a lot of murals in the United States and in Mexico afterwards. So let's go ahead, and here we are in Rockefeller Center. So here's the mural, here's the sketch that he submits to Rockefeller. He's like, this is what I'm gonna make. And it doesn't at all look, and there's some elements that are there, but this is what he makes. Very different. That
Does not look.
and I like this a lot more. There's something. This feels very disjointed, and I see a lot of the elements here that will go into the next one, and I think he kind of organizes a lot more, just better. It looks more organized like now, and I think what's so great about this is even though I've got all that overwhelming stuff, it's subordinate to a central figure, which is like you, the viewer, almost kind of making sense of everything in the background. So what's going on here? Remember, it was originally called Man at the Crossroads. This was destroyed by Rockefeller because he included Lenin. I think we had mentioned this at the beginning of the intro. Here's Vladimir Lenin, not John Lennon. And this is, and he wanted to put Lincoln. He asked Rockefeller, said, could you put Lincoln in there instead of Lenin? Interesting for me though, even if you put Lincoln there, I still think that doesn't really solve the problem, which I would think is like, you're kind of, so well, what do you think is the message of this painting? I think we kind of went over it before. Anyone want to tackle that? Or what's he really saying?
What are the things in
So those are two
No, but on this side of it, there's like, I don't know if that's bacteria.
Yeah, so here
what's
we've
it?
got like industrial agriculture.
Yeah.
Here we've got the macrocosm, cosmic view of through telescope, the
Okay.
lens. Here we've
And
got
then
microcosm, right?
Okay.
Here we've got capitalism and communism. Now, this is my interpretation. I think it's pretty kind of straightforward. Darwin, Condoleezza Rice, sorry. And there's like an X-ray and Darwin, monkey, parrot. He's like pointing at a monkey here. So I think it's kind of like natural selection, survival of the fittest, you know, protect the weakest, you know, organize society along like kind of the weakest. And of course you want to blend of both, you know, duh. But like it seems like he's saying capitalism is like by design dangerous and or violent. Here you've got a Zeus-like figure with a Christian cross here. And as you pointed out last time, there's a headless statue with a swastika here. So, you know, the fascist symbol is, you know, sticks bundled together. So it seems like he's saying with Christianity you've got this, you know, idols and all that, but then also all this negative stuff. And here you've got no God, and it seems like is there anything here that seems kind of negative? I mean, this seems like Hitler. This to me looks like a kind of Hitler thing. So I don't know how he's kind of reconciling all that. But it seems like he's saying this is all good, except for the headless God, which I don't think anyone would be like, oh, that's good, a headless figure. But it seems like he's saying this side's good and this side's bad. Am I wrong about that? It seems, I mean, I don't see anything overtly negative here, except, you know, this seems kind of bad. And, you know, people with bayonets and gas
Except your
masks.
agriculture on the bottom on the left, it's healthy on the right.
Yeah, it's
all wilted.
healthier here than on this side. Absolutely, that's a good observation. So I can't. So it seems like what he's saying here is that man's at a crossroads. You've got two choices, this or that. And of course, I think that's where it's so silly to be so absolutist.
Could we be struggling with how to bring the two together and mix them together and have the good of both?
Yeah, I think just looking at his other paintings like that Detroit painting, it seems like he's trying to be a unifier, bring everyone together and look at capitalism and celebrate it. And I think
I'm sorry, what's the one at the top right there?
on the top
Top right.
the headless statue.
No, like behind.
I think those are people marching. That's my impression, because the red hat seems like a bunch of like kind of Soviet serfs or something kind of thing, kind of marching together. And these look like Soviet soldiers too, or looks kind of like that, like
Can
Stalin.
they be protesting?
Yeah, I think people rising up and protesting. So,
So
taking
that's some negative.
well, I think, yeah,
It's something.
yeah, it really, but I would think you would. It seems like he's saying this is violent kind of, and then that side's like the masses, the people.
Two things,
Mhm.
how did Rockefeller destroy it, and did Diego still get paid for it?
Yes, he still got paid for it, but it was destroyed.
How did he
Who
destroy it?
destroyed
Rockefeller's
junior
work.
or senior?
We'll get a good question. I think it's probably senior, but I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. Let me see here.
There's
Well, they were pictured
another,
both together.
another thing with, because I had heard this, so I had to look it up. There's apparently, somewhere in there's Rockefeller, a caricature of Rockefeller.
Well, yeah, in the
drinking.
one he did later in Mexico City, he put Rockefeller in here somewhere.
And then apparently above him is a petri dish with
Yeah,
serious bacteria.
Yeah, I think that could be kind of mocking.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Keep in mind, Frida Kahlo, with Ford, she went up to him and kind of mocked him for his anti-Semitism. So, Ford has his own kind of, everyone has their own issue. Everybody hates somebody, I guess, right? But in this case, I think Rockefeller is just more kind of, I think at this point, Diego Rivera knows that his friends are criticizing, his communist friends are criticizing him for being too celebratory of capitalism. So he's trying to do his best to be like, no, I don't celebrate capitalism, I'm just kind of...
Although capitalism is pain.
Exactly, I think that's the ultimate irony, I think, of all this. And now, people do, I think, set aside their differences against Hitler right before World War II. I think you'll see that especially when we look at Lorenzo and the others. This whole effort for people in the Western Hemisphere to put aside their differences to unify against Hitler, and yet, this is just kicking the can down the road until after the Cold War. Like, well, which is the right choice, communism or capitalism? But this is kind of this romantic period before that reckoning was really, forced. So, anything Christian here? So I think the central figure is almost like a crucified guy. I see not a guy who's like uplifted by this stuff, but really kind of burdened by this kind of tension between either or. And yet it's so interesting because in the Detroit murals, it was industrialization that unified everyone. In this case, it feels more like we're terrified by the kind of godlike powers in the hands of humanity, and there's no kind of sense of like, oh, let's have faith in a higher power. No kind of, it's a real kind of deliberate kind of iconoclasm of the tradition, and it seemed like they're saying all that tradition is bad, and so it seems like he's making a criticism. And I think that's what Rockefeller understood. I don't think Rockefeller was just like Lenin. I think he was just like, let me do something, and he won't do it, he won't change it, so now I'll be forced to destroy it. Because I don't think Rockefeller would have wanted. I mean, the irony, I think, is he's kind of wrong. I think it's not like a choice of either or. It's like, no, we need a blend of fighting for the weakest and incentivizing people who have talent to succeed and be productive. So what I think is so interesting here is what's missing is that kind of uplifting spirit. The spirit that's like, oh no, in spite of all this, let's see something beautiful, see something kind of positive, because they're very downbeat painting. It's not a very happy painting, unlike the Detroit murals, which I think are very positive. Because this isn't like, ooh, the splendor of top technology and all before nature. It's like, no, nature is just like, that's not the Garden of Eden, that's like industrial nature. And in a way, you could say this is like we've gone so far beyond Christianity that's like, yeah, that's what's missing here, is some kind of spiritual kind of connection, because it's really kind of criticism. All these different groups are, there's the elite, and each area is kind of different group, and these are police brutalizing the protesters, and so yeah, I think remember he knows about eugenics. Eugenics is kind of applying science to social engineering, and about eugenics, right? Treating people as like kind of people you can creating a better race. So there might be an underlying sense of technology will be a force for bad, whereas before it looked like technology was just like this panacea. So this is the painting he repainted in Mexico. So you can go to Mexico City and see it. It looks like an inferior painting, to be honest, when you look at it.
What are the things on the side of the X?
These are like lenses producing this kind of diffraction.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so these are big lenses. But it's really interesting artistic choice for him to have the central figure. Forget the communism stuff or capitalism stuff, just for him to organize everything in such a clear way around a central figure means he's gotten away from that Mexico mandate to get rid of hierarchy. Now he's in the United States. It's a totally different experience, totally different subject matter. And so I think that's why he goes back to let me have a central figure linking everything together. Looks like this is Trotsky. This looks like Karl Marx. And this is a different version than the one he did in this is the one in Mexico City now. It's everything more or less the same, but there's some subtle variations. Yeah, it looks like he's pointing to the monkey here. So there's Charles Darwin. And his little baby holding the monkey. And it's like a little lamb kissing the baby. So I don't know, this looks very like internet generation kind of spectacle, and these people passively viewing things. That's my big critique of millennials. They're always judging things. Like back in my day, you went on the dance floor. You didn't care about people photographing you, and everything being photographed and videotaped now. So they don't do anything. That's like they just sit there and judge other people for doing things that are bad. So, anyways, wrapping things up, this mural was destroyed, and this is the other style that we'll talk about when we get kind of further along with this series. But I think it's to his credit, Diego Rivera really embraced a more, and this is part of the next good neighbor policy. Do you know who this is, by the way, right?
Eleanor
Eleanor Roosevelt. I just love this. So what you see in Guatemala is like looking away. When you shake hands in Guatemala, it's not like this firm handshake. It's very much like And it's really weird. If you're an American shaking hands with people with this like flaccid handshake, it's really weird. But that's kind of the nature. So this guy's like completely intimidated by this, huge Amazonian, which is like what was Eleanor Roosevelt? Is that her name?
Yeah, 6 feet.
Yeah. So, but what a fascinating kind of meeting of two worlds here. And yeah, this is I think maybe a photograph of the sketch he did. And Frida Kahlo and him would end up going back to Mexico, and his career would continue onward. But I don't want to overwhelm you because there's too much to go over. So next time we will talk about Orozco, and he's my favorite artist, and he's the one who makes a mural that survives. It's in Dartmouth College. I mean, the Detroit mural was still around, but to Diego Rivera's discredit, I think it's really too bad he can't go to New York City, because it means every year, every day, people go to New York, don't learn about Mexican muralism as a key component to U.S. art, because what we'll see, by the way, very quickly, the WPA, after Diego Rivera goes back to Mexico, we hire a bunch of artists to paint our way out of the Great Depression, inspired by Diego Rivera. So you go to San Francisco, you go to places all over the United States, you see this Diego Rivera-inspired artwork to elevate us out of the Great Depression. So that's the real lasting impact. But people don't learn about this when they go to New York because they don't see a Diego Rivera mural, because Diego Rivera was too unwilling to compromise. And honestly, I think it's to his discredit, not to his credit, because he might have scored points with his communist friends. But from the longer picture, bigger picture, I think it would be really neat. Because most people, when you think about U.S. art in the 20th century, you think of European artists coming to the United States after World War II to escape Hitler, and that abstract art really defined American art after World War II. And that's kind of because we didn't, people like Rockefeller deliberately were like, we don't want another Diego Rivera painting more Stalin and Lenin, so let's not commission any muralists, let's do abstract expressionism, totally safe. And so I think that's really because Diego Rivera really pointed the finger in Rockefeller's eye, and Rockefeller after World War II was like, no more of that muralist crap. And that's it's an interesting story. We'll talk more about that as we go forward. So next time we'll look at Orozco and his murals up in Dartmouth College, which I think are the most interesting of the ones we'll see. And I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Well, actually, we'll